So I'm going to be giving a presentation on the Scottsboro Boys trials. This is one of the most monumental cases in American history, and it took place between the years of 1931 to 1937. So a little bit of background on the case. On March 25th, 1931, um, on a freight train in Alabama, a fight broke out between a group of whites and a group of black men. So when the train stopped in Paint Rock, Alabama, the Scottsboro boys were arrested by police and were also surrounded by a mob of armed men. The Scottsboro boys consisted of Charles Weems, who was 19 years old, Clarence Norris, who was 18, Andy Wright, who was 19, Haywood Patterson, who was 18, Olin Montgomery, who was 17, Ozzie Powell, who was 16, Willie Robertson, who was 16, Eugene Williams, who was 13, and Roy Wright, who was 12. So as you can see, their ages range greatly from the ages of 12 to 19, but they're all relatively young. Originally, they were only going to be charged with assault for their fight with the white men, but there was a plot twist, and they ended up being charged with rape. So they were accused of rape by Victoria Price, who's on the left, and Ruby Bates, who's on the right. So these two women were discovered on the train dressed like men. They had a prior history of being prostitutes and were charged with that before. So in order to avoid being charged again with prostitution, they agreed to testify against the Scottsboro boys to avoid charges due to their sexual activity with the white men on the train. So in the future, Bates would later recant her testimony and actually advocate for the Scottsboro boys' release, whereas Price continued to testify against the men and hold that they raped them. So the first round of trials began on April 6, 1931, which was actually 12 days after their arrest. This was held in Scottsboro, Alabama, under the jurisdiction of Judge A.E. Hawkins. The defense attorneys that represented the Scottsboro boys was Stephen Roddy and Milo Moody. Milo Moody was a 70-year-old formerly retired attorney who hadn't represented a case in decades, and Roddy was a real estate lawyer from Tennessee. So not only was he not even a defense attorney, he was also from another state and wasn't familiar with Alabama laws. And these people only had 12 days to put together a defense for the Scottsboro boys. The chief witness was Price, and it said that she gave a very amusing and dramatic testimony and that the whole courthouse was laughing. They called the other witness not as suitable, maybe because she wasn't as dramatic and wasn't as upfront with her testimony as Price was. There was also an all-white jury. So as you can tell, this whole case was not very fair. It was not very balanced at all. And it was said that the crowd of 8 to 10,000 waiting outside, they were described to have a lynching spirit. That's why the defense attorneys and the judge tried to expedite the case, because they didn't want the crowd to get too rowdy, because there were armed soldiers who had to protect the courthouse from the mob. So the trials were divided into 4 cases. Originally, the defense attorneys wanted to try the Scottsboro boys all in one trial, but since their ages ranged so greatly, they had to just divide it into 4 to make it quote-unquote more fair, which we all know it wasn't. But anyway, the first case was the case of Charlie Weems, who was 18. No, sorry, Charlie Weems, who was 20, and Clarence Norris, who was 18. This took place on April 6th to April 7th. They both were tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Next was Hayward Patterson, who was 18, from April 7th to April 8th. He was also tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. And from April 8th to April 9th, Andy Wright, who was 19, Ola Montgomery, who was 17, Ozzie Powell, who was 16, Willie Robertson, who was 16, and Eugene Williams, who was 13, were tried, convicted, and also sentenced to death. And now, the last day, on April 9th, Roy Wright's trial ended in a mistrial because of a hung jury. 11 out of the 12 jurors wanted to sentence him to death, except for one juror who wanted to give him life imprisonment due to his young age of 12. They set the execution date to July 10th, 1931. So this is all happening very, very fast. This, at the time, was also a very controversial trial. So there were two responses. Obviously, the mob outside were very happy. They wanted them to be convicted and sentenced to death. But of course, there was people who saw the injustice, and the NAACP offered Clarence Darrow as a defense attorney, and the Communist Party International Labor Defense also got involved and offered to take over the case because they wanted to use this as a recruiting tool for members. And they offered the attorneys George W. Charmley and Joseph Brodsky. So the Scottsboro boys ultimately went with the International Labor Defense. So after the International Labor Defense took over the case, George Charmley motioned for new trials, and he did it under the evidence. He gave evidence that through private investigation, he showed that the two women were prostitutes, and that he had evidence that they were lying. That was denied. He also motioned for a change of venue, and that was also denied by Judge Hawkins. So he took it and appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court. He argued that his clients didn't have good representation and didn't have adequate time to prepare for the trials, and that the jury was tampered with. In a 6-1 vote, he was denied. And the Alabama Supreme Court upheld their prior decision. However, they granted Eugene Williams, the 13-year-old, a new trial, but kept 7 out of the 8 death penalties, and they just rescheduled the execution. So Charmley took this appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Powell versus Alabama. And in a 7-2 vote, the Supreme Court granted him a new round of trials based on the 14th Amendment's due process clause to competent legal counsel. So the Supreme Court agreed that the Scottsboro boys were denied adequate legal counsel by the state of Alabama. So that way, they had a new round of trials, which is good for the Scottsboro boys. The new trials were moved to Morgan County, which is presided over by Judge James Edwin Horton. The prosecutor was Thomas Knight, Jr., whose father was actually part of the Alabama Supreme Court that upheld the decision to execute the Scottsboro boys. The new defense attorneys were Samuel Lebowitz and Joseph Brodsky. Samuel Belowitz is a New York lawyer who had no connection to the Communist Party, but he was described as a really strong lawyer who had never lost a murder trial ever in his career at that point. So the second round of trials began with the trial of Hayward Patterson. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by the jury. However, Judge Horton really believed that Hayward Patterson did not commit the crime and that he was innocent. Therefore, he set aside the conviction and granted him a new trial. After that, Judge Horton, after that, the cases were removed under Horton's jurisdiction and moved to a new county. So Hayward Patterson was retried and sentenced to death. Later on, Horton was defeated in his re-election. So this kind of shows you the importance of public opinion and how public opinion can affect the justice system. Because Judge Horton stood up for what he believed in and gave Hayward Patterson another chance, he risked his political career. So after this incident, the trials of Wright and Williams were moved to the juvenile court because they were younger. Patterson and Norris got death sentences in their new trial, but the U.S. Supreme Court overturned their decision, and they came to the landmark decision that race could not be used to exclude jury participation, meaning that African Americans were supposed to be allowed to be on juries. Because before, when they vetted African Americans to be put on the jury, they would always find excuses not to put them on, even if they were educated enough or even if they were qualified enough. They just weren't treated with the same respect, and they just weren't given the chance. So therefore, the trials weren't fair. So the ultimate result that came out of the new round of trials was that Hayward Patterson was convicted of rape and sentenced 75 years in prison. Ozzie Powell was convicted of assault of a sheriff and given 20 years in prison. Clarence Norris was convicted of rape, given the death sentence, which was later reduced to life in prison, and he was later pardoned altogether in 1977. Andy Wright was convicted of rape and given 99 years in prison. Charlie Weems was convicted of rape and given 75 years in prison. Roy Wright, Eugene Williams, Olin Montgomery, and Willie Robertson were released and dropped of all charges. And then in April 19, 2013, Alabama's Governor Robert Bentley signed documentation that officially pardoned and exonerated all of the Scottsboro boys from the charges that the crimes that they were charged with. So this case was very important due to the two decisions that the Supreme Court made during it. So the first one was the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause to competent legal counsel. So that means the parties they have the right to good, adequate legal counsel. They have time to prepare and have a good defense set up. And also that race could not be used to exclude participation for anybody. And it's also important to recognize through this case the significance of public opinion and how it could affect not only a career in the case of Judge Horton, but also the justice system as a whole. So Thank you for listening to my presentation. And that is the Scottsboro Boys Trial.